Oh, welcome back. And before I talk about Fort King, I want to talk about who it's named after. Interesting story there. It's right after the First Seminole War, and the virtual background behind me is Fort King. You can see the John T. Sprague sketch, except it's been colored in, and that was done by James Gray, who wrote the book Forts of Florida and researched many of the forts, and he did a nice job of coloring some of the forts in. So, I thank him for that. And this is from the book from the State Library. Anyway, Fort King is named after Colonel William King. He was head of the 4th Infantry Regiment, and he died just shortly before the fort was established in 1827. It's known as Camp King, and was there for, about 2.5 years, and then abandoned for about 3 years and then reactivated as Fort King. So anyway, Colonel King, he also had a plantation in Alabama, which a little bit more about that later. And William King, he joined the army in 1808, and he did very good. He rose quickly in the ranks during the War of 1812. And after the War of 1812, he was put in charge of the 4th Infantry Regiment, and he was the old school. He came down in Florida with Andrew Jackson in the First Seminole War. Colonel King was of the opinion that the floggings will continue until morale improves. And uh, the United States Army at the time was trying to modernize. The Army and Navy were originally based off the British Army and Navy and some of the French. Well, the European powers, they had kind of an unlimited resource of uh, people to draw into its ranks to impress in the ranks of the Army and Navy. The British colonies and the French colonies would impress a lot of those people into their armed forces. The United States did not have such a luxury. And when you give 50 lashes for a soldier for being drunk, that kind of is bad for morale, and you have a lot of problems with recruitment if you harshly punish your soldiers. So the United States tried to reduce some of the punishments. For example, at West Point, instead of branding on the hand with a D, for somebody who had deserted from West Point, it'd say just get some India ink and write a D on their hand, just kind of like getting a magic marker and write it on there. So the floggings were kind of frowned upon. Uh, William King, he is became the military governor of Pensacola. Andrew Jackson took over Pensacola, said that they were inciting the Seminoles to attack the United States. So Jackson said, "Oh, I'll help you out and take over and bring law and order back to the territory. And we'll keep Pensacola and let Spain have it back when they can get a better army and kind of take charge of the situation." Uh, Spanish Empire was still kind of devastated from the Napoleonic Wars at this point. Uh, so William King, he's the governor of Pensacola. Pensacola remains in the United States' hands until the Adams-Onis Treaty is signed in February 1819. So actually, the United States held Pensacola for about 9 or 10 months, so a lot longer than you would think. And Colonel King, the forces in Pensacola, he had about 130 soldiers, and they're deserting in droves, mainly because you flog them and beat them. You don't let them out at night. You hold curfew and keep them in the dank, dark Fort Barrancas. So he had a lot of desertions. In fact, one of the monthly returns has about 8 or 10 soldiers desert in 1 month, which is a very high number. Another soldier that would get drunk, he had a problem with some soldiers going out on the town and getting drunk, even though he had the curfew. And one of the soldiers was severely punished. uh, by ducking. What they say, they hold them underwater and bring them up, and as punishment, well, one of the drunk soldiers that they did it with, it ended up the soldier drowned, and that was not good. One of the deserters that ran off, Colonel King's orders were that if you find him in Spanish Florida, just shoot him on the spot. Immediate execution, no court martial, no trial, nothing like that. Now, if they make it to Alabama, just detain him and bring him back to the garrison. Do not shoot him if he enters U.S. territory. And I think there's actually a reason for that because Colonel King had a plantation in Alabama and he didn't want to create waves by executing people without a trial. Even killing your slaves was kind of considered very harsh back then, believe it or not. There's actually laws against killing your slaves, even though it probably happened. So Colonel King, what he's doing is kind of shocks everyone. So he's brought up on court martial. Now, this is very serious and quite something else because there's Colonel King is what we call a full colonel, a bird colonel. There are only 12 in the U.S. Army at this time. The U.S. Army is about 9,000 soldiers strong, coming out of the War of 1812. And I guess it means it has 12 regiments if you have 12 bird colonels. And so, in a little bit, the United States will actually be at peacetime and reduce the size of the Army in peacetime. But a little bit about that later. So, Colonel King, he's brought up in court martial. So, let me find the first news article. Now, I went through the military affairs papers, and I read the whole 52-page trial of Colonel King or the court martial. Very quite extensive, but I'm just going to get the synopsis from the papers. Otherwise, we could be here all day going through it. It says Colonel King, whom General Jackson left in command at Pensacola, is reported in the papers to have ordered his men sent in pursuit of a deserter and put him to death the moment they should arrest him, which order was obeyed, and to have ordered another to be ducked for intoxication, in consequence of which he was drowned. So he executed these, and so he's put on put on court martial. Now, court martial at that time, there was no judge advocate corps. They may bring in a civilian lawyer, but the judge advocate became the military officers on the board. They would just get some high ranking officers put in charge of the court martial, and they would review that. And so it's pretty much like a regular trial with the prosecution, the defense back and forth. So anyway, that was from the Portland Gazette, June 8th, 1819. Let's go on to the next newspaper article, the Evening Post. And the Evening Post, February 14th, 1820. So this is going down to the end. Adjutant and Inspector General Office, extractive general orders at the General Court Martial begun and held in Montpelier, Alabama. They were going to hold the court martial in Mobile, but yellow fever was ravaging the city. The officers did not show up for the board, so it was moved further inland to Montpelier, which is coincidentally where Colonel King also has his plantation in that area. On the 23rd of November last, that's 1819. This is now paper February 14th, 1820, of which Lieutenant Colonel William Lindsay of the Corps of Artillery was president. Colonel Lindsay will actually be, during the Second Seminole War, he'll be the one to build Fort Alabama, which later became Fort Foster. So he's still has some role in the Seminole War history. Okay, Colonel Lindsay was president of the court. S.D. Hayes Esquire, judge advocate, uh, was tried. Colonel William King, 4th Regiment of Infantry. The court sentences the prisoner. Now, prisoner is kind of a broad term. He wasn't really kept in confinement. He was allowed to come and go to his plantation. Colonel William King of the 4th Regiment of U.S. Infantry to be suspended of all rank, pay, and emoluments for the space of 5 years from the date of the ratification of this sentence. The President of the United States approved the proceedings of the General Court Martial in the case of William King of the 4th Infantry and directs that sentence suspending him from all rank, pay, and emoluments for 5 years be accordingly carried in effect. So Colonel King, he's suspended, and so he kind of loses his job at this point. 4th Infantry Regiment, it's then the command goes to Robert Butler, who was brought up by Andrew Jackson. He is the ward of Jackson. Robert Butler was also the one who signed the execution orders from Arbuthnot and Ambrister uh, during the First Seminole War. So he has quite an interesting history too. After 6 months as the 4th Infantry, the U.S. Army is in peacetime and it reduces the size of the Army. And he's reduced in rank to Lieutenant Colonel and made second in charge of the 6th Infantry. He doesn't stand for that, says, I got too many kids I got to feed. I can't take the reduction in pay, so he resigns. And later he becomes the Surveyor General in Florida. I actually have a video I did earlier of his gravesite near Lake Jackson Mounds in Tallahassee. And so after that, Duncan Clinch becomes commander of the 4th Infantry. Colonel Clinch, I made a video of his gravesite a couple months ago in Savannah, Georgia. Colonel William King, I don't have his gravesite. Apparently, he's supposed to be buried in Mobile, but I don't think anyone has a picture of his grave. I haven't seen one. I don't even have a painting or an image of him either. But anyway, let's get back to our story. This is from the Woodstock Observer, May 30th, 1820. And let's go up to the top corner. In the House Committee on Military Affairs, to whom was referred the report of the Secretary of War containing the proceedings of the court-martial of Colonel William King, made a report concluding the following resolution. Resolved, the President of the United States for requested to strike from the rolls of the Army the said William King of the 4th Regiment of U.S. Infantry. So he struck from the rolls of the Army, which basically a nice way of saying that he's fired, that he's out here. Interesting enough, also on the same article, talk about a resolution of the president to prohibit slave trading, African slaves brought over to the United States, and also a resolution against piracy. So that's kind of interesting. So Colonel King, he's struck from the rolls of the Army, and even though he was suspended for 5 years, he will not get his job back, but he'll try anyway. Kind of at the same time, Andrew Jackson, he's dropped from the Army. What happened is that the Army reducing in size has two major generals. They have to get rid of one. So Jacob Brown, he wins out, which was the right choice. Jacob Brown becomes commanding general of the Army. Andrew Jackson, he's dropped, but he's made territorial governor of Florida. So on May 30th, 1821, Jackson ends his time in the Army, and next day, June 1st, 1821, is now the territorial governor of Florida. So Colonel King still trying to get his job back. in the army, and he goes back to Congress and petitions them. So this is from the Pittsfield Sun newspaper in 1825. This is 5 years later, December 29th, 1825. Going down to the middle, it says following petition was presented to Congress by Mr. King of Alabama, the petition of Colonel William King, late of the United States Army, stating that he's tried by a court martial and properly organized and was suspended for 5 years, which now the term has expired. During his suspension, the Army has been placed on peace establishment and his name dropped from the list. He prays the Senate to take the subject in consideration, make such a disposition of it as they may think proper. He's trying to get his job back. He is not successful of that, which is just as well because a few months later after that, I think it's early 1826, Colonel William King, he dies. He's only about 40 years old, so he might have died from yellow fever or the mosquito-borne illness that was still ravaging the Gulf Coast. And so when Fort King is established in 1827, or Camp King, uh, Captain James Glassell is the first commander, and Duncan Clinch, he's commander of the forces in Florida. 4th Infantry, they name it after their late regimental commander. And that's where Fort King gets its name, after an interesting individual who was a high-ranking officer that was court-martialed just a few years before. But anyway, thought you might find that interesting. Quite an interesting part of Florida history. And I'll talk to you later.